In each group, they measured the rate of loss of telomeres. So the group not doing any practice, the rate of loss is what you call your standard loss in 6 weeks. Those who did mindfulness, there was a tiny little slowing down, but not really very much. But in those who did the meta, who are cultivating compassion and kindness, there was no measurable loss of telomeres at all during that 6-week period.
While working as a biologist in the pharmaceutical industry, Dr. David Hamilton became fascinated by the placebo effect and the mind's power to influence our bodies. Eventually, he left the pharmaceutical industry to focus on exploring this human potential full-time, and since then, he's written 11 books, mostly focusing on the mind-body connection.
A placebo believing it to be a painkiller, then the belief itself, the expectation that this will help me, actually causes your brain to produce its own painkillers. Your brain has natural versions. They're called endogenous opioids, meaning they're endogenous, they're your own version, and they get produced through the expectation this tablet here will help me. So they get produced even when you have a real medicine.
In this conversation, David shares how our beliefs, expectations, and visualizations can have a powerful impact on our bodies far beyond what conventional wisdom tells us.
So the basis of why it is that elite athletes, including Jack Nicklaus and Ed Moses and many, many others, have been so successful with the use of visualization, the neural basis of it is the fact that when you visualize something, you literally shape, you sculpt, you mold your brain circuits in the same way as if you were actually doing the thing. So therefore, if you do the mental training, do the visualization work, your brain thinks, I've already practiced this. You get extra practice, so when you come to do it, you're much better at it, or you improve substantially faster because you're doing essentially more practice.
David shares many fascinating studies which defy our current model of healing and illuminate the untapped potential of the human mind.
They got a group of volunteers and they said to them, if you could look at the clock every minute or two and make a note of the time, and then make a note of the condition of the wound, because what we want to understand is how the wound changes in time. What the people didn't know is what the researchers had done is speeded up the clock by about 20 minutes. So in other words, they thought an hour had gone past, but actually only 40 minutes had gone past. Now previously the wound had taken an hour to heal, but this time they thought an hour had passed, but only 40 minutes had passed. But guess how long the wound took to heal? 40 minutes. So the wound healed significantly faster.
David's most recent work focuses on the impact of kindness on the physical organism. He's discovered that focusing on genuine kindness seems to do everything from slowing down the aging process to even improving our appearance. Could kindness be the ultimate longevity in biohack?
General population, with people doing a 6-week practice again of that style of meditation where you cultivate compassion and kindness, and the inflammatory response to stress was substantially less, as you could actually see it dropping with time. So at different time points in the study, the more time people spent cumulatively doing compassion and kindness based meditation, the stronger the anti-inflammatory effect was inside our blood vessels.
Before we get into this conversation, I want to ask you to join this amazing community of consciousness explorers. This whole idea of pursuing expanded consciousness and the boundaries of human potential while living a modern life is relatively new, which is why we interview revered masters, teachers, experts, and practitioners to help you on your own journey. To stay up to date on the latest conversations, simply click subscribe below and you'll be notified each time a new episode comes out. I am so grateful for all of your support and comments. I love reading them. Now let's dive into this conversation. David, how are you?
Excellent, Scott. How are you today?
I'm good, man. I'm very excited to be chatting with you. And I had just so much fun exploring your work more thoroughly before this conversation. And I think where I'd like to begin is, when did this curiosity around the mind-body connection really become an important part of your life?
Well, you know, to be really honest, when I was about 11 years old, this might sound really corny to a lot of people, right? But I was in the school library and a book fell off the shelf Now, I don't know if I knocked it or something, and it was
Whoa.
called The Magic Power. It was called The Magic Power of Your Mind by a gentleman called Walter Germain. And I didn't know, I knew in a library you borrow books. I didn't know you're supposed to join the library. I just put it in my bag and borrowed it. But the reason I did it though is because my mum was struggling with postpartum depression after my youngest sister was born in the mid-70s. And so this was like 5-6 years earlier. And she didn't get the right treatment. So they didn't understand it as well as we understand postpartum depression today. So my mum developed panic attacks and, clinical depression, a lot of anxiety. And so I just wanted to help her. So when I saw that book and it fell off the shelf, my immediate instinct was, I bet that I can help my mum. So I took it and I brought it home and I gave it to my mum, and it didn't cure depression in a day, but what it did do for her is it taught her tools and strategies and insights about the mind and the mind-body connection, things like meditation and affirmations, and also things like, kind of more deep consciousness natured stuff. And so it helped my mum so much because it taught her tools and strategies that helped her navigate a course through some of the difficult times in her life. It wasn't a cure, but it was certainly something that helped her, like a support. And so all the way through my teenage years, from 11 years on, when I found that book for my mum and I would talk about the power of the mind, and talk about the mind, visualization, consciousness, and that became a huge part of my teenagers. When other kids were listening to music, I was setting up little experiments in my bedroom, about the mind and all that kind of stuff. And
Nice.
so when I entered formal education, my PhD is organic chemistry, which really teaches you how to construct medicines at the atomic level. And so I ended up building medicines in a pharmaceutical company. But what really intrigued me was the placebo effect. And the reason it intrigued me is because it played right into what I'd grown up thinking about, was the power of the mind. So where my friends would celebrate how effective a new drug was that we'd been working on, I was so passionately interested in why it was that so many people improved on placebo. And again, it was only because my mum and I had so many conversations throughout my teenage years on the mind.
Wow, that's amazing. I love, I don't know if you've seen the movie Interstellar, where books are dropping
Oh,
off the
yeah.
shelf almost fatefully.
Yeah.
But I can't help but think about how that happened for you. And it really, those type of magical synchronicities really are just the splendor of existing. And I
I
think,
know, I know.
One thing I'm always curious, right, is I don't know at what point you decided to leave the pharmaceutical industry, but this fascination and, frankly, the science about the power of the mind, like, how was that received inside of that industry amongst your colleagues?
Hey, do you know, among my close friends, they found it absolutely fascinating. And I still have a couple of friends who are very senior in the industry who still find it fascinating because the science basis is there. I didn't talk about it more widely among the office and the labs because I did assume that people would laugh at it, because even at the time I was an amateur athlete and I was experimenting with visualization to aid my performance. I was a long jumper. And I was experimenting with visualization to supplement training because I was aware of some research that had been done, and that was met with a wee bit of laughter among some of my colleagues, and so I decided not to really press the matter further and talk about the scientific basis of the placebo, because there really was at that time a scientific basis. There was an understanding that when a person takes a placebo believing it to be a painkiller, then the belief itself, the expectation that this will help me, actually causes your brain to produce its own painkillers. Your brain has natural versions. They're called endogenous opioids, meaning they're endogenous, they're your own version, and they get produced through the expectation that this tablet here will help me. So they get produced even when you have a real medicine. They get this, they top it up basically. And so that basis was already there, and that's what I used to chat among my good friends with, and they thought it was fascinating because there was a little group of us that were always reading books about the power of the mind and consciousness and reality. And we all, like about 4 or 5 of us, we found it fascinating. Still do to this day, the ones that I'm in touch with. But I just didn't talk too much more widely in the company because, as I say, people didn't meet the visualization for athletics with a lot of good humor.
I mean, it's very fascinating, right? Because I've heard you talk about Ed Moses, and we can talk about that. But just to name another example, Jack Nicklaus, one of the best golfers of all time, he visualized every putt going into the hole before he took a putt. And actually, I think he visualized every single shot. He's been quoted on air to say that he has never taken a shot without practicing in his mind before. And so
Yeah,
it's very
yeah.
fascinating to me that here we have, the evidence in the performance of some of the best people in the world talking about this thing, yet it's met with such skepticism.
Yeah, I
I'm
think
curious
that,
about that.
yeah, what I realized a long time ago is skepticism is usually based on the idea that surely that can't be true. It's rarely based on having any knowledge of a subject. It's usually based on surely that can't possibly be true. And so even when if you haven't heard of anything or studied it, then a lot of things can sound a bit too fantastical. And I think that's what I used to find when in my early days when I talked about using visualization is no one had really heard about it so much back then. So it was always just kind of met with skepticism. Where now we know that, Jack Nicklaus, for example, when you visualize something repetitively, especially when it comes to a physical movement, your brain processes that as if it's actually happening. In fact, there's research from Harvard when volunteers were asked to play a sequence of 5 notes on a piano repetitively over and over again for a period of time over 5 consecutive days. And they had their brain scanned each day. And the region of the brain connected to the finger muscle had grown like a muscle substantially in size. But while they did that, a separate group of volunteers, instead of playing the notes with their fingers, they played the notes in their mind. So they closed their eyes, put their hands flat on the table, and imagined that they were playing the same sequence of 5 notes for the same period of time over the 5 consecutive days. Now, they also had their brain scanned every day. In both groups, the researchers focused in on the region of the brain connected to the finger muscles. And amazingly, in those who'd imagined playing the piano notes, the brain circuits had changed to the same degree as in those who actually played the notes. And if you look at the brain scans side by side and you mix them up, you cannot tell the difference between those who played the notes with their
Wow.
finger and those who played the notes with their mind. So the basis of why it is that elite athletes, including Jack Nicklaus and Ed Moses and many, many others, have been so successful with the use of visualization. The neural basis of it is the fact that when you visualize something, you literally shape, you sculpt, you mold your brain circuits in the same way as if you were actually doing the thing. So therefore, if you do the mental training, do the visualization work, your brain thinks I've already practiced this. So you get extra practice. So when you come to do it, you're much better at it, or you improve substantially faster because you're doing essentially more practice.
Well, incredibly powerful idea. And I think,
Yeah.
I've just to synthesize what I've heard as it pertains to improving our physical health, right? It seems like there's this mechanism of expectation or belief that can literally trigger the production of kind of the natural healing mechanisms or chemical production. And there's also this notion of mental rehearsal. And so if someone is sick, let's say, let's say someone has cancer or some other type of illness, how does this understanding change how one might try to experiment with alternative approaches to healing?
Well, you see, when in terms of cancer, for example, a study came out a few years ago, and it was a group of women, almost 100, about 98 women who had breast cancer, all of whom were receiving the same treatment. So it was surgery, radiotherapy, chemotherapy, and hormone treatment. So they all got the same treatment, but half of them were asked to do a daily visualization of their immune system destroying cancer, right? So everyone got the same treatment, but half of them got treatment plus visualization. So you were comparing treatment versus treatment plus visualization. And they visualized daily their immune system. Many of them visualized the immune system like piranha fish going and destroying tumor. Some of them visualized the immune system like Pac-Man, chomping, destroying the tumor. But in each case, the immune system in their mind's eye was actively destroying and chewing up the cancer. And some of them also visualized, people with medical knowledge visualized the immune system like actual immune cells engulfing and destroying the cells. But in each case, the visualization was an active immune system and the cancer getting destroyed. Now, in those women, it was an immunology study, so they weren't looking at the final outcome. What they were looking at was what impact did that have on immune function? And what they found is the immune response was much better in the women who used visualization in addition to the treatment than it was in the women who got the treatment alone. In fact, even after 4 cycles of chemotherapy, I'll quote the researchers here, they said the immune system was still highly cytotoxic, i.e. killing cancer, but only in the women who were visualizing their immune systems destroying cancer. Isn't that absolutely amazing?
Wow. It is amazing. And it makes me just wonder, like, why isn't visualization a part of every protocol, right? For some of these serious illnesses? Like, why has this not been more widely embraced if the evidence is there?
Yeah, I think it's getting there slowly. I think we come back to that whole notion of believability. Something, it doesn't sound possible kind of thing. And this is often why some things take a long time to get in, because the evidence is there. You know, it's very clear to the researchers working in the field, for example. It's very clear, it's obvious even how it works, but it takes a long time. It's like it's like dragging a heavy, object with a piece of rope. It takes a while because you've got to get through the believability thing. And even though there's people that have done it, even though there's evidence, it takes a while for things to filter out. I mean, for example, even when I first was looking into the placebo effect, when I worked in formal, pharmaceutical research, I started that 30 years ago, and left the industry, 20, just over 20 years ago. And even then, evidence was there, but people mostly viewed the placebo effect with skepticism. It was at least a decade, maybe 15 years longer, before we formally accepted it. And there's no question now, even, I don't know any researchers who know anything about the mind-body connection who would deny the existence of the placebo effect and the underlying basis of it, i.e. the expectation drives the production of brain chemicals. But, it took a while. And so when you get to things like this, people visualizing enhancing immune function during cancer treatment, it's not that it doesn't work. It's just it takes a while for people to believe it. And that means it takes a while for more evidence to accrue.
Makes complete sense. Are you aware of any studies where where it's basically visualization without a treatment against the treatment, and there has been some study of that versus just kind of an enhancement to a treatment?
No, not so much, because if you wanted to publish in a scientific journal, you could never pass an ethics committee. So the reason why these studies are slightly different from other types of studies is because ethically you can't deprive someone of a treatment and just use visualization alone. So in these kind of visualization studies, it's always treatment versus treatment plus visualization. Now, in some studies have directly visualized just enhancing the immune system. Look, so there's an antibody in our saliva, and it's called salivary immunoglobulin A, or SIGA. And researchers in Hawaii found that just daily visualization of multiplying the volume of antibodies actually significantly increased the levels of antibodies. But there's not so much research saying let's do visualization instead of a physical treatment. And again, it's down to the fact that you couldn't ethically deprive someone of a treatment that has been medically shown to be effective. But it doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of evidence, because a lot of evidence, for example, has been collected for people who've had a stroke, everyone gets physiotherapy, but half of them get physiotherapy plus visualization. And every single study, even meta-analysis of the data, what you see is those who do physiotherapy plus visualization recover much faster than physiotherapy alone, and much more than physiotherapy alone. It's a bit like coming back to Ed Moses and Jack Nicklaus. They wouldn't practice visualization instead of hurdle practice or instead of golf practice, you do both. And so I think that's a safe approach in the sense that I would never advocate someone use their mind instead of medical advice, because we don't know enough about, in terms of research we've done, we don't know enough about whether it would work for everything and how safe it might be and what the contraindications might be. We don't know enough. And so ethically, I would never, ever suggest to anyone use your mind instead of medical advice. But in addition to, I would always say that it's like you don't meditate instead of sleeping. You know, you meditate and you sleep, and you might sleep better, kind of thing, but you don't do it instead of, kind of thing. So I think in most cases, visualization is not something people tend to use instead of medical advice, whatever type of advice they're following, but it's something they tend to do in addition to, especially when it comes to serious conditions. Fair enough, it'd be different with mild conditions. Like personally, if I've got like a mild kind of thing, like I play tennis, so I get little knocks and strains, and I use visualization for those kind of things to accelerate my recovery before I go for any other types of intervention, kind of thing. But that's not a serious condition.
That makes sense. So it seems like, you know, visualization has the capacity to impact our physiology in perhaps ways that are underappreciated. How else have you seen the power of visualization used effectively?
Could I share a little, fairly recent study I find fascinating, because researchers are curiously wondering how far into the body's systems does this idea work? And one of the studies that were recently done was fascinating. They looked at the rate of healing. Now, again, ethically, you can't put a wound on a person, a serious wound on a person, and measure how long the mind could take to heal it. But what you can do is, through ethics committees, that you can put minor wounds that take a short time to go away. Like, for example, you can use those Chinese cup therapy things where you put a cup on the skin and you twist it, you create a vacuum, and you pull it off, it leaves a bruise. And the bruise takes a finite amount of time to go away. So one of the things researchers might do is that, or they put a little burn, a temporary burn thing that just, like a heat thing, not a proper burn, but it takes a measured time to go away. What they did in this study is they then got they did this to everyone, they got a group of volunteers and they said to them, I would like you, if you could help us here, if you could look at the clock every minute or two and make a note of the time, and then make a note of the condition of the wound, because what we want to understand is how the wound changes in time. What the people didn't know is what the researchers had done is speeded up the clock by about 20 minutes. So in other words, they thought an hour had gone past, but actually only 40 minutes had gone past. Now, previously the wound had taken an hour to heal, but this time they thought an hour had passed, but only 40 minutes had passed. But guess how long the wound took to heal? 40 minutes.
40 minutes.
So the wind healed significantly faster. In another group, they slowed the clock down by 20 minutes. So they thought an hour had gone past. An hour 20 had gone past. Guess how long the wound took to heal? An hour 20. Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah, I mean, it points to something which I've noticed in my own experience, which is, matter tends to conform to the information in our consciousness, right? To the expectations of what we think will happen, which includes the functioning of our physicality.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I believe our minds are capable of far more than we ordinarily think. There's just, when it comes to scientific testing, there's a limit to what a person would ethically want to test out, kind of thing. But I think we're capable of significantly more than we give ourselves credit for.
Absolutely. And this to me is like, this has been something that yogis and, Taoist masters and kind of many people steeped in contemplative traditions have been advocating for a long time. And it's exciting to me that, we're starting to have science start to bring credibility to a lot of this. And I still think there seems to be just significant hurdles and kind of like, it's in some ways, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy with our conditioning where it's like, well, science says this is possible. So I believe that's possible. And guess what? What ends up happening. And so, I don't know how we could kind of speed up the rate of change for our potential and allow more people to kind of suspend disbelief, so that we could access some of that potential.
Yeah,
But it is
I think
encouraging.
and I think what you see really oftentimes is a bell curve. And at the very end of the curve, you've got a small group of people researching the frontiers of things. And they pave the way, they show us what's possible. And it just takes a little while for the rest of the bell to catch up. And it's moving in that direction. It just takes a little while because the whole bell's coming at the same time. There's people at the fringes always pushing it out, and they're doing sometimes miraculous things, that sound literally unbelievable to the average person, but they do it routinely. But it just takes a little while for the bell. And one of the reasons that science takes a long while is because one of the tenets, especially when it comes to medicine, is first do no harm. And so there's often a, a little reticence. You don't want to cause harm. You want something to work, but at the same time, you're a little bit worried yourself of that being harmful. So science plods along when it comes, at least when it comes to this sort of stuff, at a very slow rate. But there's always people stretching the bell curve, regardless, who are really, really pushing it out. And so I tend to often check in and see what they're up to, kind of thing. And then I come back
I
and,
don't blame you.
what I consider some of my work to be about is trying to cross that bridge between science and spirituality, science and the mainstream, or different gulfs basically, and just try to communicate between different groups of people, the language that different groups use, and try to get us to a point where we're better able to help ourselves in a number of different ways.
I love that. I love that. And yeah, it's something I'm passionate about too. And I think one of the kind of emerging areas of research that I know you spent a lot of time on is kindness, and how kind of kindness is like a latent superpower or emergent state of being that can help us. And so I'd love to hear about kind of, maybe we start with like how this got interesting to you, and I'd love to learn what you've learned.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons it got interesting to me was when I began to really start exploring spirituality. And when you start practicing things like meditation techniques and stuff, and read some of the spiritual texts, what begins to become clear is that we're all connected. And maybe, it's my belief that consciousness permeates all things and everything is deeply interconnected and interdependent. So why would I therefore not just feel compassion for all people and all things? That for me makes logical sense, that all I would want to feel is compassion. And when I practice these techniques and when you read the ancient texts, they all talk about compassion because that's a natural state, I think, that emanates from aligning ourselves with this idea that we're all connected. Because why would you want to cause harm to something else that's part of you? If we're all
That's right.
connected, why would I want to cause harm to one part of my body? I would always want to heal it, to help it, to make it whole. So therefore, I would feel compassion. And so my interest in kindness came through a spiritual exploration of saying, what's the point of it all? Where could I do most good? And then for me, it became clear that I would like to start studying and researching kindness and compassion, because if that might well be the answer to a number of the problems in our lives and in the world, is if that is what naturally exudes from us when you reach that deep spiritual state, then perhaps if we just practice this more in our lives, and if I can share some science and give people an extra little impetus to do so, then maybe that will unite us a wee bit better. Maybe we'll stop arguing with each other. We'll stop fighting with each other, and we'll start looking out for each other and helping each other out a little bit more. Maybe make this little blue rock floating in space a much happier place. And so that was the basis of why I started researching kindness.
Amazing. And I mean, since you've done that research, there's been some pretty incredible findings. For example, I've heard you talk about how kindness can impact our longevity, how kindness can actually be better than Botox, which for, all the pretty faces out there, I'm sure they want to hear more. And so talk to us about some of the things that you've learned.
Well, the Botox thing for a start. When you have an experience of kindness, it produces what I call kindness hormones. Now, I call them kindness hormones really to draw a parallel with stress hormones, because stress hormones like adrenaline, cortisol, they're produced when you have an experience of stress. Now, that's independent of the situation, because two people can be in the same situation, but only one person gets stressed, the other doesn't. So therefore, only one person produces stress hormones. So the stress hormones are produced by the experience of stress. So to draw a parallel, kindness hormones are what I call the products that get formed in the brain and body when you have an experience of kindness. And what you actually find is they go in the opposite direction. Nearly everything in the body that stress does, physiological and stress hormones do, kindness hormones do the opposite. And so let me come back to the Botox thing. One thing we know is when people have prolonged stress, we began to understand, we always wondered, now we understand why. When we have prolonged stress, chronic stress over a period of time, our skin ages. And the reason for that is because the stress causes the production of little things called free radicals. So in science terms, it's called oxidative stress. And that means it's the biological version of everyday mental and emotional stress. So the mental and emotional stress that we experience on the inside, that's called oxidative stress. What in everyday language we call these things free radicals, but they build up in our skin, they build up in the muscles and the brain, they cause memory loss, they can lead to dementia, they lead to hardening of the arteries, they lead to heart attack, stroke, all the different things of aging. But in the skin, one of the things they do is they age the skin. So what research has done is they put kindness hormones, they increase kindness hormones in the skin cells. And amazingly, the kindness hormones actually neutralized the free radicals. And what you saw was levels of free radicals dramatically dropping in the presence of kindness hormones in skin cells. Now, interestingly, you cannot drink kindness hormones, you cannot eat them, you cannot put them in a green juice or a smoothie. You can only produce them on the inside. And one of the ways you produce them is through experiences of kindness. So if you up your kindness, and the thing is, it's got to be genuine. And I call this nature's catch-22, because if you're not genuine with it, then you'll never have a felt experience of kindness. And it's only the felt experience of kindness that generates kindness hormones, not kindness itself. It's the felt experience of it, because a person could just be kind because they think it might make them look good, but there's no kindness hormones then. It's the felt experience of kindness. So I call it nature's catch-22. You only get the benefit if you mean it. And so if you mean it, so your act of kindness is genuine and honest and heartfelt, then you turn on the tap, out come the kindness hormones, they kick out the free radicals in the skin cells. And that's what I was meaning when I made that video that kindness is better than Botox.
Nice. So, for all the longevity hackers out there, if you feel like, all right, well, my next thing is I'm going to be kind to just, donate money so that I can live longer and I can look better. That actually doesn't work. It has to be, an authentic,
honest and heartfelt
emanation.
Genuine. Yep. 100%. I call that nature's catch-22.
Yeah, I love it. You can't sneak one by nature. Which I've definitely learned. So, understanding the benefits of this is amazing. I would ask for you, like, how can one go about kind of cultivating that genuine kindness in their lives?
I think it starts in our mind, really. It starts in our willingness to be kind, because it's the right thing to do. And so for me, that begins with thinking kindly of people. I mean, one of the simple things I say to people, but it's so real, is try not to be hard on people and try not to prejudge people, because you don't always know what a person's dealing with in their life that might be responsible for a type of behaviour that you might not really like all that much, whether it's just the way a person's being or not. And I remember, I lost my dad just over a year ago, and he had a brain tumour and, a glioblastoma, and it was right out the blue. And it was a tough time for my dad, a tough time for the family. But during that time, I really understood that idea that don't judge people because you don't know what they're dealing with. I'd said it a lot, but I remember clearly the first time I felt myself on the other side of that, pleased that someone didn't judge my behaviour. Because what happened is I used to drive my dad to his radiotherapy treatments. He'd had surgery and he was getting radiotherapy. I've got three sisters, but they all work in full time. Two work in the NHS in the UK. The other's a school teacher. So I had more flexible time because I'm a writer. I can make my own time. So I used to drive my dad. I used to go pick up my mum and dad, and then drive them about 50 kilometres to the hospital to get the treatments. And one day I was running late and my dad needed to get there super early. He always liked to be there 40 minutes early. It was just the way the tumour affected him, made him anxious about being really early. And one day I was running late and I was annoyed at myself for running so late. I was driving along the motorway along the freeway faster than I should have been going. And we wouldn't have been late. Would have been maybe 15 minutes early, but my dad needed to be 40 minutes early, and that means a lot to him. And I was pulling off the freeway onto in the UK we have these little mini roundabouts, like rather than just junctions, it's a wee roundabout in the traffic circle round. And I wasn't looking where I was going because I was so caught in my head. I was so annoyed, disappointed in myself for being late. And it's important to my dad. I was feeling sad about my dad's condition. And I wasn't thinking, I wasn't paying attention. And I pulled onto the road and I almost crashed because there was another driver already on the little mini road roundabout thing. And both of us hit our brakes at the same time. And it was a screeching, and we missed each other by a centimetre. Now, usually at those times, the first thing the person will do is peep the horn, and then you get a mouthful of swear words and aggression and anger. I couldn't have handled it that day. I was fragile that day because despite the front I put to the world and the happy videos I put out on social media, no one knew what I was really going through and how fragile I felt. I couldn't have handled that kind of treatment. And I didn't get it because in that moment, instead of being angry and honking his horn, the man in the other car, he looked at me and his face was so soft and he smiled and he went, "It's okay. On you go. It's okay." And he just waved me on so gently and kind. I drove round the roundabout. I pulled over about 50 metres further on and I burst into tears. I wept at the side of the road. I was so overcome with his kindness and also the fact I felt so fragile in my life. And I really understood then what that phrase meant. Don't judge people because you don't know what they're going through. I'd said it like the way we all say these things, but I really got it that day because I was the one who was hoping to not be judged. No one had any idea what I was dealing with in my life. Had he been angry, he would have had a right to, because many people do get angry for those reasons. But I was just so fragile and I was really dealing with a very difficult time in my life. And thankfully, he didn't judge me. He chose kindness. And for me, I really understood what that term meant. And that helped me to really get that point. That's where kindness starts. For a lot of us, it's just don't be so harsh on people because you never know what people are dealing with behind closed doors, and so just be a little gentler. And that's where kindness starts, I think, in our minds.
Yeah. And kindness to ourselves too. I think that creates conditions to be kind to others.
Absolutely, yeah. It's one of the things I advocate is don't forget to be kind to yourself. And I think there's a sweet spot somewhere between the extremes of kindness to others and looking out for your own needs. And I think somewhere in the middle there's a sweet spot. And it's different for different people. It depends on where you are in your life. They say you can't pour from an empty cup. Now, some people's cup is quite full and they have plenty of energy to keep helping others. But sometimes people's cup is almost empty. And for their own health, their own mental and physical health, they have to pour their own cup, fill their own cup first. So that sweet spot is further over the other side. And I think the sweet spot varies, but it's definitely there. And what the sweet spot really means is be aware of your own needs. Don't neglect your own needs. Help other people, but also recognize your own needs and find that balance point wherever it lies for you at this moment in time.
Yeah, it's a powerful metaphor and understanding to kind of recognize that that might shift, right? There might be times where you need to just take care of yourself, and there may be other times where, yeah, you want to give and help others and maybe give more of yourself. I hope you're enjoying this conversation so far. If you like what you hear, let me know by clicking like, subscribing to the channel, and responding with a comment around something that you found interesting in the conversation so far. In addition to these videos, I do a lot of writing on the exploration of consciousness and my own personal revelations in my newsletter called Consciousness, the Doorway to Human Evolution. To receive these updates and more, all you need to do is simply head to the link in the description below and you'll be added to the community of 20,000 plus consciousness explorers receiving weekly ideas and inspiration in their inbox. I look forward to hearing from you there. Now let's get back to the show. One thing I've heard you talk about is the impact of kindness on our telomeres, which I found to be quite interesting. And so I don't know if everyone knows what telomeres are, but maybe we could start there and then get into how they interplay with kindness.
Yeah, so telomeres are like those little plastic end caps on your shoelaces. So on your shoelaces, the little plastic end caps are called aglets, and they're there to stop your shoelace fraying. Because if your shoelace unwinds, you have to go and poke it through the little hole. So you end up, the shoelace is useless. So on the end of our DNA, we also have aglets. But they're not called aglets, they're called telomeres. But they play a similar role. They're there to stop the DNA unraveling and then becoming useless because when DNA is being copied and all that, it unzips to a point, but not fully. If the telomeres weren't there, then it would unwrap fully and the DNA of the cell would just die. So they're there to protect the cell. But what happens, just like our shoelace aglets wear down over time through repeated stress, so our telomeres also wear down over time through repeated stress, and measuring the length of them, or more precisely, the rate that they wear down, is one of the most accurate ways of measuring a person's biological age. And now, when I say biological age, you have two ages. You have your chronological age, which is the number of years you've been on this earth. Your biological age, on the other hand, is the age of your body. And there's usually a disparity. So people who have a very healthy lifestyle, for example, tend to have a biological age that's younger than their chronological age. And that's why it's important to eat healthy, to lead a healthy lifestyle, because it improves health span and therefore also lifespan. So with some research, scientists taught a group of people a Buddhist meditation that's called metta, or in the West, it's translated to mean loving kindness. And basically, you think of people and you think kindly of them. So usually there's a structured version where you say, think of people in your life and you say, may you be happy and well and safe. May you feel at ease. Words like that, around that idea, where there's a general sentiment of wishing compassion and kindness to people. Sometimes you could do it visually. And so what they did, they taught a group of volunteers how to do that practice daily for 6 weeks. And they were compared against people not doing any practice at all. And then as a middle ground, other people were taught mindfulness, which is really just a simple form of being mindful of your breath. And in each group, they measured the rate of loss of telomeres. So the group not doing any practice, the rate of loss is what you call your standard loss in 6 weeks. Those who did mindfulness, there was a tiny little slowing down, but not really very much. But in those who did the metta, who are cultivating compassion and kindness, there was no measurable loss of telomeres at all during that 6 week period. None at all. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that if you practice compassion, kindness based meditations, I call them kindfulness as opposed to mindfulness, then it doesn't mean you'll never age. But under those conditions, there was definitely an effect on the telomeres that was highly suggestive that compassion and kindness cultivated has an anti-aging effect in our right in our cells.
Wow. Yeah, it's amazing. And, It's funny, all of this science again, I just, I've read so many stories of yogis and kind of highly evolved beings who are just love, right? Like they are that original essence. And they talk about how like their eyes look different and their complexion looks different. And they have this young vitality body, even though they might be like 80 years old. And, you know, perhaps some of the science is actually getting to some of the mechanisms that make that state.
I think you're right, Scott, because not just the telomeres, but other research suggests that the same style of compassion, kindness based practice, again, I call them kindfulness, has a very powerful anti inflammatory effect inside our blood vessels. Scientists were measuring the inflammatory response to stress, i.e., basically the levels of things called inflammatory markers. So, indications of inflammation in our blood. And they compared people in the general population with people doing a 6 week practice again of that style of meditation where you cultivate compassion and kindness. And the inflammatory response to stress was substantially less in those who did the practice. And what was interesting is you could actually see it dropping with time. So at different time points in the study, the more time people spent cumulatively doing compassion and kindness based meditation, the stronger the anti-inflammatory effect was inside our blood vessels. And that, I think that kind of stuff is fascinating because it is suggestive of we're beginning to discover the underlying basis between some of these people who have been embodying love and compassion in their life. Science takes a little while to catch up, but I think we're definitely beginning to uncover some of the underlying mechanisms.
That's amazing. Are you familiar with the jhana meditations or jhana meditation style?
Uh, only very briefly.
That I don't claim to be an expert, but I've had a number of people on the podcast that are very into it. And essentially the meditation style is to just love everything. It's like you love every sensation you're witnessing, whatever arises, whether it's a feeling in your body or a thought that comes up or a sensation, an inner experience, and you're just opening and loving all of it. And it drops you into these profound states of bliss. You know, I would compare them to kind of psychedelic type experiences where you're just completely blissed out, and the bliss can last for, you know, for me, I've had bliss last from these meditations for up to 2 or 3 weeks afterwards from a single style of this practice. And so I would be very curious to to look at how this impacts some of these that style of meditation impacts some of these biomarkers, because it's a slightly different but same idea as
Yep.
the meta meditations of just loving things.
Yeah, I would agree with you because it's just, as I said, science takes a while to catch up. As far as I know, that's not been tested, but I would predict, as you said, because that's similar to, I didn't know what that particular style was called. That was similar to a style of meditation I intuitively started to develop just through practice. And for me, it's loving everything. So I do a mindfulness style of meditation, but then I drop into imagining the core of my being, and the only sense I then get is just love everything. And I get
Mm.
this, I usually have this feeling that consciousness is that which animates and is all things. And therefore, if I want to align with the core of my being, then the way to do it is to love everything. Just love everything. So during the practice, that's what I do. Not every time I do it, but that's what I intuitively find myself going to in the meditation. And I do feel like I get into a much more deeper state of compassion than I do when I compare that with other types of meditation practice. But as far as I know, that style of formal practice hasn't been tested, or at least tested as far as I know in science. But like yourself, I would predict that some of the effects would be a little more pumped up, a little stronger.
That's a beautiful practice. I really like that. And it definitely aligns with some of my own experiences. Earlier you mentioned, you know, kind of following or tracking some of these miraculous emergent people that are very on the fringe of the bell curve. What types of stuff in the world of kind of mind body connection, mind matter connection are you curious about and excited about the continued study of?
I really love the work that IONS are doing, the Institute of Noetic Sciences. I've been following their work for years. In fact, it was reading Dean Radin's work years ago that first made me aware that there was actually formal study in this kind of field. One of the things that I love about that particularly aligns with my view of things is one of the findings they've uncovered is that let's, for example, you're saying a prayer for someone, or some formally researchers might call it, you have a distant intention for a person. If you feel a connection with the person, or if you feel empathy for the person, and other researchers have done something similar, even using MRI scanners or EEG, brainwave devices. But if you feel empathy, compassion, like a genuine, heartfelt wish for the person, then the effects seem to be much stronger. And that very much aligns with my view of things, which I've experienced through my own meditation practices and the research that I've done in the area of kindness. And so I particularly find that kind of stuff fascinating. It's almost like a way to pump up the power of our prayers, or pump up the power of our positive, distant healing intentions for people if we first have a genuine, heartfelt wish for the person to be free of their suffering, which again is exactly what the Buddhist metta technique is about, a heartfelt wish for a person to be free of suffering. And so that what I see on the fringes of research, and much of that stuff in the mainstream isn't taken seriously, but it's absolutely real as far as I'm concerned. And their research is so powerful and really credible, even statistically. But it very much aligns. That's what I would say out in the fringes of what the mainstream would consider, the mainstream bell curve would consider normal. And so when I look at that stuff, I think that's absolutely amazing, and it so ties in with the general research on kindness that I'm popularizing in the mainstream.
Mm. Yeah, it points to the interconnectedness that you talked about
Yeah,
earlier,
absolutely.
right? Where
Yeah.
it actually affects other people, not just our own inner resources. And I think there's other powerful qualitative examples of that, of people knowing when a relative dies, like people
Yeah.
feeling when someone has something sad to them. How is that, right? It's so fascinating.
Do you know Scott? They call some of those experiences that are known as telesomatic events. I think it was Larry Dossey who first popularised them. I don't know if he came up with the term, but they're known as telesomatic events, and it's when you get a physical sensation in your body when something happens to someone else, but the effects are much stronger if it's someone you have an emotional connection with. So they tend to be observable far more often in people who, like couples, or mother and daughter, siblings, father and daughter, mother and son, permutations, variations of people who have a strong emotional charge. And if that strong emotional charge is there, then very frequently, in fact, far more in the general population than most people would assume, you often get this sense when something's happening, or something happens to someone that you're very close to. So collectively, they're known as telesomatic events, as
Mm,
in distant feeling events.
very cool. I haven't heard that term before, but telepathy, somatics, it makes sense that if you combine them,
Yeah, yeah.
it might be that. One thing I'd love to get your opinion on is, I've had this kind of personal thesis that aligns with a lot of your research, where basically our imagination is kind of this atrophied superpower muscle that we just lose as adults, right? Like we just are so
Yeah.
mired in the doing, we're not really ever using our mind in that way, ever bringing a lot of intention to it. And I think a lot of the research that you have spent time with and done around visualization points to that. And I just wonder, like, how, like, what do you think of our like imagination? Like, what do you think of its potential, and maybe how we can actually work with it more skillfully than has been conventional?
Yeah, I think the limit. I don't know if there's even limits to our imagination. I think our imagination is exceptionally powerful, and I totally agree with you. When we're children, we're just free to imagine like magical, fantastical things. But as we grow up, we stop believing in a lot of things, and so it's almost that the imagination begins to get covered up in dust, and that dust becomes thick dirt and concrete and rocks and stuff, and we get smaller and smaller as we grow up in terms of what we'd like to imagine. It's only when we get much older that we start to try to chuck all this stuff away, because intuitively we feel that there's more to life than that. And so one of the things that I find helpful is when we start to understand that, and I use science for this really. One of my taglines is using science to inspire, and it's really just to help people to understand, if you realize science is saying the same thing that you probably intuitively know, that your imagination can actually shape your brain circuits again. It can move your brain chemicals around. It can change, your immune function. It can do a lot of fancy things, speed up, slow down healing, all that kind of stuff. And maybe even that, for me, I believe that consciousness is the base of reality. It's that which animates and is all things, and that's not the mainstream view, but then it is a decent enough view. And I believe that when you imagine something, what you're actually tapping into is the infinity of everything that exists, of consciousness of everything that exists. And maybe one of the stumbling blocks to us, achieving and experiencing wonderful things in our lives is believing or having somehow accepted in our lives that it's not possible. But when we're children, we don't accept those same limitations. But as we're adults, we do. And maybe one of the reasons why many adults don't find wonderful, miraculous things happening in their life is because we don't believe it. We don't think it's possible. Can I share an example of my dad? When I said my dad passed away, my dad had spent the last week of his life in a hospice. And during the week, because it was impossible for my mum to cope anymore. Mum was also in her late 70s. And in the moments before my dad passed away, my brother-in-law and my niece left the room. And for the first time in a week, it was only the immediate family, mum, dad, my three sisters and myself. And I immediately had this sense, this is the first time that there's not been any other extended family, nurses, friends, anyone visit. It's just us. And I suddenly had this profound sense that my dad was waiting in this moment. And I closed my eyes and I held my dad's hand and I closed my eyes and said, "It's okay to go. It's okay, Dad, you can go now. It's fine. You can leave now. It's just us." And at that moment, I knew I'd heard stories of people in their final seconds of life opening their eyes. Now, it wasn't possible for my dad to open his eyes. His body was dying. I'd never seen a dying body when the body breathes by itself really fast. But in that moment, the moment I had that picture in my mind, my dad opened his eyes very gently. We all got to say our goodbyes to him. And that, for me, reminded me of the magic that we sometimes don't believe in, the wonderful, amazing things. And in the time after that, some equally fantastical, magical things that would defy odds would happen. And I knew it was like my childhood mind had opened to these amazing, fantastical possibilities again. My child mind, something had burst open. And that imagination just allowed things. And I remember a few days later, I got to the top of the stairs in my mum and dad's house, and I would always intuitively look that way because my dad's the bed was there. My dad was bedbound for the last two weeks upstairs, and I always just looked when I got to the bathroom at the top of the stairs. There's my dad. Check he's okay. Just instinctively. I was on the phone to my partner. I was walking up. I got to the top of the stairs, and the phone went fuzzy. I went, and I went, oh. I said, oh, I'm losing the connection. And at that moment, I just looked over to where my dad would be, and the phone went off, and I took the phone away, and the screen slid across by itself, and came my dad's contact. It says, Dad.
Oh my gosh.
And I went, oh my God, it was incredible. And a number of little things like that happened round about that time, like driving through a rainbow, for example. I didn't think that was possible. But I said to my dad, can I have a wee miracle, a wee show me that you're still here? And the rain had poured down, it disappeared, and a rainbow came on the road. And I drove through this deep magenta and blues and greens. And I never imagined you could drive through a rainbow. But right after I said, Dad, can you show me you're still here? A rainbow appears, and I drove through it, like intense, sparkling off the water off the road, just intense. It was like someone was shining a deep beam of torchlight on my car. It's incredible. And just little magical things that I think the passing of my dad just cracked me open again and reminded me of that magical view that we have as a child and we just forget as adults. And maybe if we reminded ourselves of it again, maybe many more amazing things would happen in our life. Things that we haven't even conceived of could possibly happen for us in our lives.
Such a beautiful story, man. And I just have the chills hearing about it. And yeah, I mean, I think if you believe that consciousness is the most fundamental basis of reality and things need to basically take form in consciousness before they can take physical form, it would make sense that, like, to the extent that we're open to that, right? To the extent that we explore that, to the extent that we just suspend the disbelief and say, show me where you want to go or what's possible. Like, there is these extraordinary possibilities for experience that we could open up to. And it's something I'm super passionate about. And I just love hearing examples of this. I love hearing people having these direct experiences. So I'm so grateful that you shared that.
Oh, thanks. And, and well said, well put yourself, that consciousness is that basis. And, and for me, it makes sense if everything is animated by and is consciousness, then if we open up to that, then we're not blocking it, because maybe a lot of the times we're just blocking the reality of it through our own disbelief. And the disbelief just comes through ingrained ideas that we pick up as we're going through our lives, but maybe if we got rid of a few of those ingrained ideas, then we start to have more of that direct experience again.
Yeah. It definitely, that your thesis there aligns to a lot of the wisdom traditions that I've studied, which, talk about kind of the consciousness expansion process more as a removing of impediments rather than any adding, right? It's kind of, we're getting out of the way of what already is and the majesty of it. And so it's beautiful, brother. Well, I know you have an exciting new book coming out, which I would be remiss if we didn't mention, because I know it explores a lot of the stuff that we talked about. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about that, David.
Yeah, well, actually, I just got a few advance, we look at it, that's what it's called.
Love
the
it.
use of an expletive there, the joy of actually giving a fuck. I'm basically trying to educate about kindness. I'm basically saying that what would happen in the world and in our lives, to our health, to our relationships, to our communities, to the world, if we all just started being a little nicer to each other. And so some of the things I've explored is the science behind compassion and kindness. So, for example, how does being kind impact mental health? And we know that kindness makes us, it has a happiness boosting effect. It also is protective against depression and anxiety. But it goes further, because we now understand that experiences of kindness actually shape brain circuits, and they actually literally wire into the brain, and it makes happiness more accessible. in our lives. But it goes further because kindness is physiologically the opposite of stress. And so all these stress effects are go in the opposite direction through kindness. So kindness actually experiences of kindness can lower blood pressure by changing the shape of our blood vessels. They can stimulate an anti-inflammatory portion of the nervous system. We can cause anti-aging effects in a number of different ways. One of the other things I explore is also looking at the importance of being kind to yourself. We talked briefly earlier about this sweet spot, and I also tackle some of the big questions. Like people often ask me, how do you be kind if someone's not being kind to you? And so I call these conundrums. Kindness it's not always easy. And it's not always this fluffy, fragile thing. Sometimes you've got to make hard calls, especially in leadership positions, which is something I also covered. So I explore different ways that we can make the hard call. And how do you be kind when the situation is a bit more kind of challenging? And in the book, I also talk about, I propose a practice of kindfulness as an addition to mindfulness. Because mindfulness as a practice is a wonderful thing. But on its own, it doesn't make us kinder. In fact, a subset of the population who practice mindfulness can actually become less kind, more selfish. And it's because what mindfulness does is it stretches us more into who we actually are. So people who are naturally kind become kinder, but people who are naturally low in empathy become less kind. But if we embed kindness into the practice, then everyone shifts at the base as well. So I explain how that kind of works and how the original form of mindfulness was actually taught as embedded within a form of principles that were about teaching us how to be mindfully kind in our lives, how to think kindly of people, how to speak kindly, how to lead our lives by looking out for people, by understanding the interconnectedness of the world. So I cover all of that in the book as well.
Wow. Even in your just brief description there, I learned a few things. So it sounds like a rich experience to read. So
Oh, thanks.
The joy of actually giving a fuck, David, that's going to be in July.
Yeah, 9th of July, July 9th.
Amazing. And,
yeah,
I also want to give you an opportunity. I know you've written 11 books now and you speak, and it seems like you have all types of different things that people can learn more if they're curious about following your work. So where is the best place for them to do that?
My website is drdavidhamilton.com. I'm on all the social media channels. You can link to them from my website, drdavidhamilton.com. So I'm on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, X, TikTok, all the main kind of stuff. And I post loads of videos about kindness, visualization, science, all that kind of stuff.
Amazing. Well, we'll link all those out. And David, I just want to say thanks. This was a really fun conversation. I learned a lot, and I, just super appreciate what you're putting out in the world.
Oh, thanks, Scott. It's been a real pleasure having this conversation. That's what it's felt like. It's just a conversation between two friends. It's been good fun.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll have to do another one in the future.
Yeah, definitely.
And I also want to just acknowledge everyone who listened. Thank you so much for spending time with us today, and we'll see you on a future episode.